So, Bruchim Habayim, Boker Tov, welcome everybody. Delighted to see you all again today.
Should we mute Michael?
No, you don't have to. There are not that many of us, so if somebody needs to say something, feel free to butt in and add a comment or so. If you're more comfortable muting and waiting for an opportunity, that's fine. It's up to you. So today I was wondering what should be the focus of our study today, because there's so many things going on right now. Sometimes I sit down and prepare very detailed description and list of the things that I want to cover. Today I put a very vague list together because I wanted to see how things develop over the day or two before, what kind of inspires me, what I think might be relevant. So it's a bit of a chance that things might not be as organized as you might like. I won't say as in the past because that's making an assumption that I am organized, but I won't make that one. But I thought I would start with Parashat Tazria. So many of you may be grateful for the fact that this week we didn't have to read from Parashat Tazria, either on Monday because it was Rosh Chodesh, or today because it was Yom HaAtzmaut. We had different Torah readings. And yet, as I looked at the Parashah, and the double Parashah in its entirety, Tazria Mitzorah, which in a nutshell, as you're probably aware of, talks about, at least initially, the birth of a child, but much of the double Parsha focuses on how we deal with physical manifestations on our skin, in our homes, of which we're not sure the source. We don't know what it is. We often talk about Mitzorah being a certain disease. We don't know exactly what it is, but some kind of different colored lesions, sores, scales, rashes on our skin. And then interestingly and fascinatingly, when some of these types of manifestations occur in our houses, on the walls of our houses, and trying to understand what that means. And regardless of the source of those, and there are all sorts of fascinating interpretations, it says that sometimes that sara'at is caused by things we utter, inappropriate comments we make, curses that we turn to others that are inappropriate, of course, and we suffer some kind of ailment because of that. But regardless of the source, the main focus, I thought, when looking at this Parsha is how we deal with it. And what's the purpose of our means of dealing with it? And I'm not going to go into the very detailed discussion of what is done, but the focus is that the first things we do when we see these types of physical signs of something going on that we're not familiar with, we don't know, and we're somewhat fearful of, even though the Torah does not use that term. And I would say it's definitely a fear of that, whether it be contagious, because we might be infected by it, whether our houses might be infected by it, or whether what caused it, the behavior, might be something that we're responsible for, and we might have gotten off the hook. Who knows? Regardless of that, what do we do with the person who is afflicted with these physical manifestations of something? We isolate them. We put them away. They go into quarantine, if we can use that term in a somewhat anachronistic sense. They have to leave. They leave the place where the Israelites, at least this is during 40 years, a very organized, environment, and they are put outside the camp, outside access to community, outside access to all the services that we would like to have available. And the easiest thing would be to discuss the similarity between that situation and the situation we often find ourselves in today in dealing with isolation, with quarantine, self-isolation, etc., and what that means, both on our physical as well as on our emotional well-being. But I'm not going to go down that road because that's certainly a relevant one, but not what I want to focus on today. I want to focus more on this idea, isolating members of the community, to what purpose, to what end? To help them heal, for their own safety, for the safety of others, and of course, with relevant today's context, but with the idea of bringing them back into the camp. It's not a permanent isolation. It's a limited quarantine of 7 days and then perhaps 14 days. And then after that, there's going to be some kind of healing process and the opportunity to return to the camp. It doesn't talk about what we do once they return to the camp, and perhaps the assumption and what we should see as incumbent upon us as being the camp, let's say, for those who have been in quarantine, those who have been isolated on a temporary basis, we have to welcome them back in. It's not just a matter of them coming back and fending for themselves. It means we have to do something to make sure that they recover, not just from the ailment which afflicted them, isolation, from the trauma that they've experienced at being cut off from their families, from their communities. And again, I shouldn't hesitate to draw comparisons with what goes on today. And I keep hearing is how are we going to deal with the emotional fallout, the psychological fallout of everything that we, and more specifically and perhaps more intensively, our children are going through during these days of COVID. Not just the isolation, but the complete cutoff from all the activities, social, sport, and artistic, that otherwise gives them a sense of meaning, fulfillment, growth, exploration. All of a sudden, not to have that during the course of a year, we can't imagine. None of us have ever experienced this, and certainly not as youth. We may have experienced limited access in our youth because of perhaps physical individual constraints, but we're talking about the world. We're talking about an entire world and a generation of children growing up, experiencing this, being cut off from access to all the things that they love doing and try to make their lives worthwhile as they're growing up and developing their interests. All those interests have been cut off in a tangible way. And so we're only going to start to be able to understand the impact of that. We haven't had time because there are other more urgent needs, of course, to take care of. But over the next few years, not next few months, over the next few years and more, we're going to have to learn to deal with the impact and long-term implications of what we're all going through, especially our kids. And when we look at Tazria, the understanding is that's what that community has to deal with when they welcome, and that's what should be the case, when they welcome those individuals who have been isolated and cut off for that 7-day or 14-day period, and you're saying, 7 days, 14 days, come on, give me a break. Here we're talking about a year. But 7 days, 14 days to be outside of community in the desert. It's not like you're going to go into your, I hate to use the term, man cave, woman cave, whatever you want to call those places where you can escape to and have everything available on your own. They don't have that. We don't have that today. And they didn't have that back then. So it meant isolation, being cut off, and not being able to access all those things that are so important to survival and viability in as harsh an environment as the desert must have been. So that's one element of the Parsha that struck me. And I was looking at some other interpretations, particularly the idea of the houses. So what does the house mean? I saw an article by Rabbi Matthew Berkowitz, who's the director of Israel programs at JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, and he talked about the idea of what does it mean for the home to be afflicted by this type of situation? And he says that when we look at Tazria Metzora, it is so far from our understanding, from our imagination. It's nothing we relate to. We see it as something so esoteric when we look at the Torah, this idea of something, some physical manifestation afflicting the houses, let alone the bodies of people. What does that mean? The house, our home, is supposed to be seen as a place of refuge, a place where we feel secure. And the Torah shows us that sometimes, and again, we don't know exactly what it is, something causes that home not to be that place of refuge, but a place that has been afflicted and a place that becomes threatening, a place we have to leave, if temporarily. And later in the Parsha, it says, if it doesn't remedy itself after a week, or the various efforts of the priests to perform some kind of ritual, then you remove those stones in the wall that are afflicted with this disease, whatever it is, and replace them with new stones. And if after another period of time it recurs, you tear down the house, you take the entire stone, you put the stones in another place where they will never be used again, and you have to build your house anew. And that struck me in I guess, a very interesting way as we commemorate Yom HaAtzmaut. Because when I think of houses being torn down, I had a picture in my mind of houses being torn down in Israel when people, and I don't hesitate to say Palestinians, are punished for threats, for the thought that they may be involved in some kind of terrorist illegal action. And one of the punishments that's been used in the past and still, unfortunately, is tearing down those homes, because those homes in the afflicted by some kind of plague of dissent, of rebellion, of revolt, of murder, of involvement in terrorist activities. And it's seen as a way of conveying to the members of that household that this is something that's not acceptable. And so for their house, their place of refuge, a place where we and they should feel secure, is something that is not that and can be used in the form of punishment. So it's a very harsh comparison with what we read about in the Parashah, but it's merely an association. And again, that is my association. I don't suggest that it be yours, but I'm sharing that with you because this is an image that came up when I was reading the Parashah. And so it got me thinking as I explored Parshat Tazria Metzorah, so what is the connection? Why does it happen to be interesting that it coincides with Yom HaAtzmaut this week? And then I thought about, well, what is it about Yom HaAtzmaut that is so impactful for us as Jews? And I began thinking, how do we, what is the significance of a national day to begin with? Think about what you do on July the 1st to celebrate Canada Day. Throw out some things. What do you do on July 1st? What are you thinking about on July 1st? Write it in the chat box or tell me. Unmute yourselves and tell me.
Fireworks and picnic.
Okay. Anybody else?
Parades.
What was that, Anna?
Parades. Parades.
Parades. Okay.
I think of being proud as a Canadian, and it gives me a chance just to reflect. I'm not sure I do anything separate, but I'm thinking very much about being a Canadian.
So what is that pride based on?
Freedom, freedom of choice, freedom of decision.
Freedom.
Okay, so I think, and if we look at how we celebrate Canada Day, I think that's probably the experience of many. It's a celebration, parades, picnics, perhaps a sense of pride in thinking of what we like and enjoy and feel proud about in Canada.
Yeah.
And so when I think of how we celebrate our own birthdays, probably very similar. What we don't do on our birthdays, and what we don't do for the most part on our national birthdays, is go through a period of evaluation, a period of introspection, a period of critical examination. Personally, we never see a birthday as that, although people wish us all sorts of things on our birthday that has to do with continued growth, continue this, et cetera, whatever you see. We have in our Jewish tradition, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur for that self-evaluation, for that introspection. So we don't need to do it on our birthdays, on our personal birthday. That's our personal opportunity, supposedly, in addition to family gathering, to perhaps go through that process. When do we do that nationally? Do we have a Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur to go through some kind of self-evaluation and critical examination of? No, we don't have that. Our national day, our national birthday, our national day of celebration, parades, pride, should be the day when we do that. But we don't for the most part. When we talk about pride, we think about those things that we're proud of. Do we think about those things in our national background, history, present that we're not proud of? Do we make an effort to discern those things that perhaps cause us more shame than pride? I doubt it. People are too busy celebrating, certainly for the most part in Israel and in Canada and in most other places as well, I would imagine. But maybe that's what a national day needs to be. You want to celebrate, but you also want to take a bit of a critical look and see, what are we celebrating? Are we celebrating a mythology from the past? Are we celebrating nostalgia? Are we celebrating a blinder's view of what's going on in our country today? Or are we sufficiently aware and courageous enough to acknowledge everything that goes on in our country on this day and see, no, this is great. We've done fantastic things. We've come so far in this area. But not only are we lagging, but we're doing things that are not a source of great pride in other areas in what our country is doing. Is that something we simply shovel or sweep under the carpet on a regular basis, let alone on our day of national celebration? And so my challenge to you today, and I want to spend a few minutes on that, and then I'm going to show you a video, which hopefully you'll have the patience and forbearance to make it through the whole thing. It's not an easy one to watch, but hopefully you'll stay for the duration of that and a little bit later. What is the purpose of our National Day of Celebration? I think we need to broaden what that experience should entail. It shouldn't be just celebration. It shouldn't be just feeling good about ourselves for the things that we've done and accomplished, and those are many, and we'll focus on Israel right now. But there are other things that we need to take a look at as well. And we need to be willing to do that on a day where that celebration has often taken has often been the focus, I should say, of what we experience on that day. Because when we look at a national day of celebration, we want to consider who's celebrating. You know, if we talk about Canada, who are Canadians that are celebrating? Are there Canadians, you think, who, and we'll leave this rhetoric because we have plenty of time until July 1st to consider this, and we can do that later on. But are there Canadians who are citizens that don't celebrate Canada Day because they have nothing to identify with, because they don't feel pride or great pride in the country, or because the elements in their personal experience or that which they see around them is something that causes them perhaps to have less to celebrate than many of us do? Let's jump back to Israel. So when we look at National Day of Celebration, what do we do to make sure that all Israelis, citizens of the state of Israel celebrating its independence, 73 years now, what do we do to ensure that all citizens have some element of pride and identification with the country in which they live, in which they are citizens? So at the beginning of the session, Barb mentioned that she was in Israel on Yom Ha'atzmaut a number of years ago, and she talked about being at the Kotel with the soldiers there and that great pride. So I think to myself, and I look at pictures of Independence Day celebrations, and what is our experience? And I would share something with you that somebody wonderful wrote in Israel. It's in Hebrew. If we have time, I may share a bit about that with you. A very interesting look at how Israelis celebrate. But this idea that how have Israelis celebrated in the past more often than not, magnificent parades, Anna, you mentioned that, huge military parades, air shows showing the might. That going together, of course, with all the barbecues, the mangalim that you see and can smell if you travel around the country to every national park and every open piece of green grass anywhere, you'll find people barbecuing to their heart's delight. Perhaps a little less this year and certainly not last year. But celebrating. And in Israel, it's fascinating because, and perhaps necessary, because what have they done the day before? What have they just emerged from? They've emerged from a day of mourning for those who have fallen in Israel's battles, of those who have fallen subject to terrorist incidents. And when we talk about soldiers who have fallen in battle since 1948 and events leading up to that, we're talking about more than 21,000 people. And those who have been killed in various acts of terror, more than 4,000 people. over the years. So we're talking about a huge number of people who've been directly affected by Israel's various battles and ongoing struggles for security. And to emerge from that and expect people to engage in a critical examination of themselves and how their country is performing is probably a little much to ask. You need the cathartic transition from mourning to celebration. To step from mourning to self-evaluation is maybe a big ask and maybe difficult to do. And for the first time this year, as I was thinking about this, I was thinking maybe this idea, not that anything's going to change, but maybe this idea of having Yom HaZikaron and the whole idea of the name itself is something to talk about. But this Memorial Day for Israel, the full name, by the way, not just Yom HaZikaron Memorial Day, but Yom HaZikaron Lechalalei Ma'archot Yisrael V'nifkei Peulat Ha'eva, Memorial Day for the fallen soldiers of Israel and victims of terrorism. There's a full name out there that nobody uses. We use Memorial Day because that's what we use in other countries and it's easier to remember. But we have Yom HaZikaron, we have Yom HaZikaron LaShoah, the Lagvura last week, 2 Memorial Days separated a week apart. But this idea of trying to transition from the day of mourning for our fallen in whatever way and celebration of our independence, maybe that's not the right thing to do if we want to take that Independence Day in a more meaningful and penetrating examination of ourselves. It probably is too much to ask after mourning our fallen the day before until the very night, and that phenomenally impactful transition from one mood to the next. I've always wondered how Israelis do that. I don't know too many other, I don't know other places in the world that try to make that type of transition at the change of the clock from one day to the next. But what should we be examining if we had the opportunity and the emotional wherewithal to do that? We would want to see what kind of society is Israel? What has been built over the years, and what are we continuing to build? Are the values that were essential in working towards and building up something to lead to the foundation of a state in 1948, are those the same values that drive us today, that direct us today, that inform us today as to what we should be doing as independent and sovereign people in our own land? And there are many issues to deal with. I would say that the greatest challenge for Israel, some people may say security continues to be that, but many would say that the rifts in Israeli society are more striking and threatening than ever. If you look at the recent election, you find that not just the number of parties, but the number of parties that were elected, but the number of parties that are formed in order to represent special interests. If you were to ask people in Israel, what do you have in common with other Israelis? It would be very difficult to find something that everyone shares. I'm not sure if there is. There are so many different groups, social groups, political groups, religious groups, ethnic groups in Israel today. It's very, very challenging to find something that unifies all Israelis other than disagreement about how to form a Knesset, a parliament, as is evidenced in the last 2 years. Show me another nation in recent history that has had such trouble coming to some kind of agreement about who and how to lead the country. We may be headed for another election in coming months. And this experience of the division within Israel is as threatening as anything else. The fact that people need to watch out for their own personal and group tribal interests above and beyond those of the country is something that's very challenging, to say the least, and something that's very frightening. we celebrate Israel. We celebrate its technological advancement. We celebrate its ability to defend itself. It's certainly one of the major powers, not just in the area, but in the world. And the development of means and resources to be able to protect itself from incredibly challenging threats, Iran only being one of them, is something that we should be proud of. But what are we doing to make sure that we're protecting something that we feel good about, that we feel proud about, that we feel mostly proud about? Every country has its challenges, Canada no less than anyone else. But we want to be able to say that we have great pride in our country and we acknowledge some of the very serious challenging and failings that our country has. But we don't want those failings to get to the point where they overwhelm any sense of pride we have. And we want to make sure that the pride we have is something that everyone in that country can share to some extent, in some measure, not in the same measure. That's never going to happen in any country. There are always going to be groups that don't share the same sense of identity, especially in today's open society where we have people coming from such different backgrounds, immigration of different sort. But we have to be able to find things that the majority of Israelis can share and have something in common. It means being able to bridge gaps which we haven't been able to bridge over the last number of decades, and certainly not since the founding of the state. And maybe the most blatant one, although again, I mentioned before, the social rifts in Israel are well beyond that between Jewish Israelis and non-Jewish Israelis, whether they be Muslim or Christian. There are much greater social rifts in Israel than that. But this challenge of dealing with a large portion of the population that has very little often to identify with in terms of the state of Israel is a challenge that at some point we have to come to terms with. And it's not just a matter of the Palestinians living in the territories, however we describe them, Judea and Samaria, the occupied territories, the West Bank, Gaza Strip. However, I'm not going to get into the terminology of that right now. It's also those living within the state of Israel who are Israeli citizens. What do we do to make sure that they can feel something with which they can identify in Israel? And what I've decided to do is I wanted to share a video with you, and it's not an easy one to watch, and depending on your connection with Israel. We talked about it a little bit last year, because we were in COVID times last year. I recall we talked a little bit about this. But one of the most challenging things, and those which separate us more than ever from our non-Jewish fellow citizens, if we can talk about ourselves as being part of that in Israel, is Yom Ha'atzmaut. Because we know that for the Palestinians, the day of Yom Ha'atzmaut is called a Nakba, a day of destruction, a day of catastrophe. So a completely different perspective on how we view that. And part of being able to share something on Yom Ha'atzmaut has to be a willingness on both sides, both the Jewish Israeli, as well as Arab Israeli, as well as Palestinians, to acknowledge the narrative of the other side. And I say this because it's not just us acknowledging the Palestinian narrative. Palestinians have to acknowledge our narrative as well and understand how we move forward from here. And often, I would say on both sides, that's something that is next to impossible, the greatest of challenges. But there are some groups, and I've been inspired over the last number of years by various groups, especially Palestinians and Israelis getting together who have both suffered from the conflict. Both have suffered loss in whatever way, in different ways. And there have been, for a number of years, what they call a joint Memorial Day service, which is phenomenally moving, but at the same time, it's very, very difficult. When you hear the stories from either side, and I don't know if it depends which you hear first, at one hand, you perhaps identify most and feel the sorrow and the loss of somebody from Israel whose father, brother, mother, son, child was killed either in war or in a terrorist attack. And what does it make you feel? It makes you feel anger. It often makes you feel hatred toward the other side. And then you hear a story from the Palestinian side. Again, depending on the story and depending where you are emotionally, the idea that this sharing of narratives, which may be very different, but both express a horrible sense of loss and pain, the idea that we share that sense of loss and pain is often and can be something that brings people together. And I continue to be inspired by these people who seek a nonviolent way to try to find some kind of dialogue and coexistence and perhaps better between Israelis and Palestinians. So I'm going to play a part of yesterday's joint Memorial Day service, which has two beautiful songs in which participate both a Palestinian and an Israeli, and a couple of testimonies, one from an Israeli and one from a Palestinian, sharing their loss. And I'm not saying their presentation, their narratives are any way balanced. I would never dare to say that. And you can see it as you would like. It's certainly your responsibility to evaluate, and I would never tell you how to feel about it. But just the willingness, I think, on our part as much as their part, and I know many of you may hesitate with this, but the willingness to acknowledge that there is great pain and sorrow on both sides, and often that can be a way for us to see a dialogue, a desire, and an urge and an urgency to find some way to get along to prevent others from experiencing that. It's not an easy thing. It's a challenging thing, and sometimes for us on one side of a conflict to acknowledge and accept and listen and be attentive to the narrative of the other side is a very difficult thing. So I hope that you'll be able to listen to the entire thing. It's about 23 minutes. I realize that's long, but I didn't want to take a very short section. I wanted you to try to allow yourselves to get immersed in a certain mood, in a certain environment that the organizers of this ceremony are trying to foment. And perhaps after that, we'll have a couple of minutes to speak. If anyone has other commitments and needs to leave, I certainly understand. If you feel that it's something you don't want to listen to and need to leave, I'll also understand. You needn't tell me why you left if you do. But hopefully after this, we'll just have a few minutes to talk a little bit about it. But really, I want to leave that with you to work at and consider on your own. I'll just have a couple last comments to tie in with the Parashah before we part. So hopefully some of you will still be with me at the end of that. What I'll ask you to do is when I put it on, just give me a thumbs up or let me know if the sound is okay and if you can see the picture. Sometimes the technology doesn't work as you would like. Of course, I admit that sometimes I'm a bit slower in doing this than other people. So first, let me know if a screen has come up.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, and then just give me a thumbs up if you can hear this.
רוצה עצים יפים ולא מלחמות וכתונת פסים ולא מדי צבא לכל יקיריי. אני רוצה גשם ותלמים מורקים ובתים מלאים תינוקות, רוח בריתות וכיכר רחבה ורעם וברק בשמיים וגשמי ברכה على آدما. أريد أشجار جميلة وليس الحروب وقميص مخطط وليس زي عسكري لجميع أحبائي. أريد المطر والأخاديد الخضراء وبيوت مليئة بالأطفال، نساء ورجال بميدان المحبة، والرعد والبرق في السماء ومطر البركة على וחרקום ורוד בנקיקים ומפרשי שלום על הים התיכון ותמרון סתיו של קריזנטמות לבנות בגנים وكرات حمراء تتدحرج وأكمام طفلة شعرة سلام على
ערב טוב, שלום לכולן, ברוכות הבאות וברוכים הבאים לטקס יום הזיכרון הישראלי-פלסטיני של תנועת לוחמים לשלום ופורום המשפחות השכולות. תודה למרים טוקן ולעידן טולדנו שפתחו עם השיר משאלות, מילים אסתר רב, לחן אלינוער מואב. אנחנו כאן אחרי שנה לא פשוטה. שנה קשה ומפחידה שכולנו בכל העולם התמודדנו איתה ועדיין מתמודדים. המורה הרוחני הגדול קרישנמורטי אמר על האדם להבין את הפחד ולהיות חופשי ממנו. הוא לא התכוון לפחד מנחש אלא לפחד העמוק, לפחד שגורם לצער, זה שמונע זה שמעיב על המחשבה, זה שיוצר את הקונפליקט, לפחד שמביא עמו את החשיכה. כשאנחנו מבינים שהפחד הוא שלנו, אבל הוא לא אנחנו, אפשר להניח אותו בצד ולחוות את החיים בלעדיו. וזאת ההזמנה שלנו אליכם היום. קחו את הפחד ולפחות לערב אחד, הניחו אותו בצד. הערב אנחנו מתחברים דרך הכאב האנושי המשותף, דרך האובדן שכולנו חווינו. השנה אנחנו שוב כאן בפורמט מקוון, וכמתאפשר מהנחיות הקורונה, כבר נמצא איתנו קהל. בשבילנו זה מסמן ניצנים של התחדשות, והלוואי שנצליח ליצור גם שגרה אחרת, מתוקנת. לפני שנמשיך, תרשו לי להציג את עצמי. שמי יוסי צברי, ואני פה בתל אביב, כי גם אני החלטתי להניח את הפחד בצד. ובמוקד השידור שלנו בצד הפלסטיני נמצאת חברתי להנחיה, ריידה אדון. מרחבה ריידה. מרחבה ריידה.
مرحبا يوسي مرحبا فيك ومرحبا بالمشاهدين هون في الأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة وهناك في تل أبيب وفي كل العالم. هاي السنة 16 اللي بنجتمع فيها مع بعض في أمسية يوم الذكرى فلسطينيين وإسرائيليين عشان نتشارك بالألم ونطرح طريق جديد، طريق بنوره الأمل. اسمي رائدة أدون، أنا فنانة وممثلة. أنا هون لأنه عندي إيمان بالإنسانية. في الوقت اللي في تل أبيب الجمهور مطعم، هون الجمهور بعده ما حصل على التطعيم، لأنه دولة إسرائيل رافضة تتقاسم تطعيم الكورونا مع الفلسطينيين الخاضعين لمسؤوليتها كونها الدولة المحتلة. حركة مقاتلين من أجل السلام ومنتدى العائلات الثكلى مع منظمات أخرى بيعملوا من أجل إيصال التطعيم لهون وبسرعة.
הקורונה גובה מאיתנו קורבנות רבים. כך גם הסכסוך המדמם שבתוכו אנחנו חיים. את קיצה של המגפה אנחנו רואים, אבל הכיבוש והאפרטהייד עדיין כאן, ועלינו האחריות לסיים גם אותם.
صحيح كلنا ضحايا هذا الصراع المتواصل، بس إحنا اللي صانعينه كمان. وقبل ما نبدأ بدي أدعوكم للقاءات الزوم اللي راح نفتحها مع نهاية المراسم، وراح يكون فيها نقاشات في مواضيع متنوعة تتناول دائرة العنف يلي بتحصد منا ضحايا رهيبة. اللقاءات راح تكون بالعربي والعبري والإنجليزي. مثل الخوف كمان الصراع هو صراعنا، بس هو مش إحنا، وبإيدنا نختار خيار تاني. بإيدنا نختار إنه نتقرب عن طريق الأمل المشترك ومن خلال الفقدان. فالحرب ليست قضاء وقدرا. أدعو تمار بايكس ابنة المرحوم ميخائيل وشقيقة المرحوم يوني.
مساء الخير، ערב טוב. שמי תמר, אני אומנית פלסטית, בת 53, נשואה ואם לשתי בנות. נולדתי וגדלתי בירושלים. נולדתי 3 חודשים אחרי מלחמת 6 הימים. אולי זכיתי לשמוע את קולו של אבי כשהייתי בבטן אמי, אבל לא זכיתי לפגוש אותו. אבא שלי היה איש צבא ונהרג על ידי חייל לגיון ירדני בירושלים. אחותי אמרה עליו שהיה אדם חסר פחד. נותרנו אחרי המלחמה משפחה של אמא ו4 ילדים. אחי הבכור יוני היה בן 13 כשזה קרה, ואהבנו אותו כאב. הוא שמר עלינו 3 אחיו, שיחק איתנו ולקח אותנו לטיולים. וגם על אמא שלנו הוא שמר. הוא היה נער מתוק, פרוע ואהוב, ואולי גם הוא קצת חסר פחד. אח שלי יוני היה חייל קרבי בשריון. הוא נהרג במלחמת יום הכיפורים ברמת הגולן, קרוב לתל סאקי, לפנות בוקר ביומה השני של המלחמה. המוות שלו נבע מרשלנות ויהירות של הצבא ושל המדינה, מחוסר יכולת לקרוא את המציאות בימים שקדמו למלחמה. 3 חודשים אחרי שנהרג אותרה גופתו. הימים בהם נעדר היו הימים שבהם התחלתי אני ללמוד בכיתה א'. אמא שלי הצליחה להתאושש בקושי רב, וגם אנחנו. המחירים היו בלתי נסבלים. כילדה פחדתי מערבים פחד מוות. גדלתי בשכונת אלביה שקרובה לשכונות הערביות ולעיר העתיקה. ממרפסת ביתנו ראו את חומותיה. הערבים, הקדושה והפחד היו קרובים וזמינים כחוויית חיים. בילדותי הראו כמה וכמה פיגועים שהזינו את סיוטי הלילה שלי, ובחשיבה הילדית שלי לא יכולתי להבין מה הערבים רוצים. הרע, המפחיד והמסוכן היה הערבי והשפה הערבית. בלילות הקיץ, כשהחלונות בבית פתוחים וצלילי המואזין מתגנבים לחלומותיי, נשמתי כמעט פרחה מהסיוטים. כשנחתתי במיטתה באמצע הלילה, אמא שלי הייתה אומרת שאני נופלת כמו טון הלבנים. זה היה תיאור מדויק למשקל הפחדים שלי. ב-1998 התחתנתי, וכשהפכנו להורים, חזרנו לגור בירושלים. אני מחוברת אליה, בין היתר בגלל שאהוביי קבורים בה ולא יכולים לזוז. כשאני משתתפת במפגשי דיאלוג במסגרת פורום המשפחות השכולות, ואני שומעת את חבריי הפלסטינים מתארים את מקרה המוות שהם חוו, ואת החוויות העזות של הביקור בבתי הקברות, אני מבינה שגם הם, כמוני, לא יוכלו ללכת לשום מקום, כי חלק מהלב שלהם קבור כאן לתמיד. הם קשורים לכאן בדיוק באותה הצורה, ולא יוכלו לעזוב. אנחנו הולכים ומסתבכים וטובעים במעגל של אלימות וכאב ופחד. חלקנו לא יכולים לראות שיש דרך לצאת ממעגל הדמים. אני מאמינה שאפשר. דרך הכרה הדדית, דרך התבוננות מעמיקה בגובה העיניים, דרך מתן שוויון זכויות מלא. אנחנו לא עליונים ולא צודקים יותר. ככל שאנחנו מאמצים דווקא את הפחד ולא את השוויון, אנחנו מגיבים באלימות. ומיום ליום אנחנו נהיים אטומים ורעים יותר. והרוע שלנו מקרין פנימה והחוצה. את בנותינו שלחנו ללמוד בבית הספר הדו-לשוני. אני מאמינה שידיעת השפה הערבית גם מפוגגת חלק מהפחד, וגם מנגישה תרבות עשירה שיש בה אסתטיקה ואהבת אדם. המדינה שלנו צפופה ביותר, מרובת קבוצות ותרבויות, ויש הרבה מוקדי חיכוך ומסורת עתיקה של שנאה ומלחמה ופחד. ככל שנעמיק את המאמץ להיפגש ולהכיר קבוצות שונות, נצמח ונוכל להתארגן יחד מול אתגרים. כולנו בסירה אחת קטנה. אנחנו חייבים לחתור לעבר הרחבת מכנים משותפים. כדי שכל מי שחי פה יחיה חיים טובים יותר, כי לכולנו מגיע, לכולנו.
תודה תמר. כשמגיע יום השנה למותו של אדם אהוב, נראה שפניהם של מי שאיבדו אותו משתנים לבלי הכר. אני מזמין את לילה אלשך, אמו של קוסאי, זכרו לברכה.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أنا ليلى الشيخ من بلدة بتير قضاء بيت لحم. عمري 43 سنة. جئت اليوم أشاطركم حزني في الذكرى 19 لوفاة ابني قصي التي كانت قبل يومين. تاريخ محفور في ذاكرتي لن تمحوه الأيام ولا السنوات. تاريخ قلب كل موازين حياتي. في الساعة 4 فجراً 11 من نيسان 2002 استيقظت على تصارع أنفاس طفلي قصي ابن 6 شهور، وهو يعاني من حالة اختناق وضيق تنفس نتيجة استنشاقه الغاز المسيل للدموع الذي أطلقه جنود الاحتلال الإسرائيلي في تلك الليلة في ساحة منزلنا. سارعنا به نحو أقرب مستشفى. كانت الحواجز منتشرة في المدينة، وقد أغلقوا مداخل مدينة بيت لحم معلنين أنها منطقة عسكرية مغلقة بدون أي سبب قانوني. كان الخيار الثاني أمامنا هو أخذه إلى مستشفى في الخليل، لكنهم منعونا من المرور بحجة أن لا استثناءات للحالات الإنسانية. بدأت أنفاسه بالتسارع وعيناه تنظران إلي كعصفور خائف يحتمي بجناح والدته. على الفور سلكنا طريقاً وعرة بين القرى، ولكن مجدداً أوقفنا جنود الاحتلال وكأنهم اتخذوا قراراً ضدنا. جيب عسكري أغلق الطريق، أوقفنا لمدة تزيد عن 4 ساعات بدون رحمة. لم ينفع أي شيء، لا توسلاتنا إليهم، لا بكاؤنا، ولا حتى أنين طفلي الذي يصارع الموت بين يديه. ازدادت حالته سوءاً، وكان أحياناً يغيب عن الوعي ثم يعود. أنفاسه المتقطعة كانت كسكين يغرس في قلبي. عندما سمحوا لنا بالتحرك انطلقنا بسرعة إلى المستشفى، لكن الأوان قد فات. كان وجهه كالضحى وخديه كتفاحتان حمراوتان بدأتا بالجفاف، وأصابعه النحيلة تصلبت كالشمع وأخذت شفتيه بالجفاف. قبلته فكانت قبلة مختلفة، كانت شفتاه باردة. جسده الصغير لم يحتمل كل تلك المعاناة والألم، فارتقت روحه الطاهرة إلى السماء. ارتقت وأخذت معها قلبي وعقلي وروحي التي لن تكون لي مرة أخرى. لن يكبر قصي، سيظل طفلاً ولن يعود إلى البيت. لن أشتريه له قميصاً جديداً أو دراجة جديدة. لن يذهب إلى المدرسة، ولن أشتري له الدفاتر، ولن أفرح بتخرجه من الجامعة. منذ الآن سينام وحيداً في ذلك القبر المظلم البارد، بعيداً عن دفء حضني. تلك البرودة أشعلت ناراً مستعرة تأكل كل ما بداخلي. كرهت ورفضت رؤية أي إسرائيلي لمدة 16 عام. بالرغم من كل ذلك لم أفكر يوم بالانتقام، وركزت جهدي في الحفاظ على بقية أولادي، حتى التقيت ولأول مرة بأناس مثلي فقدوا أحبائهم. حين دعيت للقاء مشترك بمنتدى العائلات الثكلى الفلسطيني الإسرائيلي. الفقدان هو الفقدان بغض النظر عن الظروف، اللون، العرق أو الدين. كان هذا هو عنوان ذلك اللقاء. لأول مرة أحسست بأنهم أناس مثلي، وأن لجميعنا نفس الألم والمعاناة والدموع. كان لقائي الأول بتاريخ 24/11/2017 مع مجموعة النساء الفلسطينية الإسرائيلية ضمن مشروع سرد القصة الشخصية. سيدة إسرائيلية توجهت إلي بعدما سمعت قصتي وقالت لي: أنا أعتذر لك، لأن من تسبب لك بكل تلك المعاناة هم من أبناء شعبي، وأنا كأم أفهم وأعلم مدى معاناتك والألم والمرارة التي بداخلك. أنا أعلم حتى ما يدور في ذهنك في هذه اللحظة، وأعلم كم هو صعب وصف ذلك بالكلمات. لم تعلم تلك السيدة أنها وبكلماتها البسيطة قد أنارت طريقي مرة أخرى، طريق كنت قد أغلقته على نفسي بنفسي، لأنني في تلك المرحلة لم يكن مهماً أن أناضل للتغيير، أو بالأحرى لم يكن أؤمن بأن هناك أمل، إلى أن لمست صدق الذين يناضلون من أجل مستقبل أفضل ليس فقط لأطفالهم، وإنما من أجل الجميع. منذ تلك اللحظة أخذت على عاتقي أن أناضل بطريقة سلمية لتغيير الواقع بكل ما أوتيت من قوة وعزم وإصرار. حملت رسالة المصالحة والسلام وذهبت بها أينما سمح لي، سواء في داخل فلسطين، إسرائيل، أو حتى على المستوى العالمي، لمحاولة تغيير ما يجب تغييره. وإنهاء الاحتلال الذي ينهك أبناء شعبي كل يوم من جديد ويوسع دائرة العنف. لا يوجد بيت في المنطقة إلا وعاث فيه الاحتلال فساداً ودماراً من الناحية المادية، النفسية أو المعنوية. هذه رسالتي لكم اليوم جميعاً. كفى للظلم والكراهية، ولننعم بالسلم والسلام مع من نحب. لو كان قصي على قيد الحياة كان عمره الآن 20 عاماً. شكراً.
شكراً ليلى. أدعو ديفيد بروزا وميرا عوض لإداء أغنية بقلبي، كلمات وألحان ديفيد بروزا وسعيد مراد.
أدم وبين أدم بزمان وبفسק זמן בונה את עולמו פורח בגנו.
الإنسان هو إنسان ضائع في هذا الزمان، يبني عالمه أزرع ورد البستان.
בליבי, בגופי, ברוחי, בחלקי, ארצנו, דמנו, נפשנו, חיינו.
عالمنا في جسدي في روحي في عقلي، أرضنا أنت في دمي في روحي أنت معي. أنت ملح البحر، النور والحقيقة.
המלח והים הם
النور والحقيقة في الصحو أو في الحلم، في عيوني أحاسيسي أنت حبيبتي.
האמת והאור מפוקח ראשיקו בעיניי רגשותיי את אהבתי.
عالمنا في جسدي في روحي في عقلي، أرضنا أنت في دمي أنت في روحي أنت معي.
בליבי, בגופי, ברוחי, בחלקי, ארצנו, דמנו, נפשנו, חיינו. علمنا الحقيقة في الصحو
أو في الحلم، في عيوني أحاسيسي أنت حبيبتي.
האמת והאור מפוקח ראשיקו בעיניי רגשותיי את אהבתי.
أنت
I want to just share one last thing with you. I came across a beautiful message from Rabbi Aviva Richmond, who works with the Hadar Institute. And when we think about Yom Ha'atzmaut, we think about the challenges and the tribulations of the Jewish people over centuries of being without a homeland. We often talk about ourselves as going from those without a homeland, the homeless sojourners, to becoming sovereign in our own land. And Rabbi Richmond entitled her words, and I'll just share a very brief part of it with you, From Sovereigns to Sojourners. And what does she mean by that? she quotes from the prayer book, our liturgy, where there's a prayer that David says that we say every morning. Vayevarech David et Adonai leinei kol hakahal. And he talks about praising God for all that God has done for him. And this is as David is about to celebrate the conquest of Jerusalem and rejoicing for all the donations that are being made to the temple. He himself, of course, never has the opportunity, only his son, to build the temple Shlomo, because David literally has blood on his hands. It ends at verse 13 of Psalms. And what does verse 14 say, which she brings to light in a very illuminating way? V'chi mi ani umi ami ki natzor koach litnadev kazot ki mimcha hakol umiyadcha natanu lach ki gerim anachnu lefanecha v'toshavim kechol avotenu ketzel yamenu ala aretz ve'en mikvah. Who am I? We don't read this in the morning service. Who am I and who are my people that we should have the means to make such a free will offering? But all is from you, and it is your gift that we have given back to you. For we are sojourners with you, mere transients like our fathers. Our days on earth are like a shadow with nothing in prospect. And what she's saying that even at the height of David's military successes, David says, we are sojourners, gigerim, we are strangers. And perhaps more than the sense of strangers, the sense of sojourners, the sense of not having ownership of the land. We often talk about the fact that earlier in Devarim, it talks about the fact that the land is not ours. We are there because God has given us the land, and we are there, similar to the quote in Breshit, we are custodians of the Garden of Eden. We are there to utilize it and to keep it. L'shomra u'le'ovda. And perhaps if we're willing, and it's a very big ask, I don't hesitate to say, if we're willing to see ourselves as sojourners in the land of Israel, and I understand the challenge, after centuries of not having a land and being subject to the whims of other nations, of dictators, of those who sought our destruction, not to take full advantage and enjoy the sense of sovereignty in our own land is something that perhaps is very difficult to do. But just as we were once refugees, and many of those who came to Israel following the War of Independence were refugees from Arab countries, and refugees from Ethiopia, and refugees from the former Soviet Union. So just as we were refugees and now are owners or see ourselves as owners of the land, perhaps we're better equipped to understand that former owners of the land, so to speak, have become refugees. We talk about the Palestinians, many who left of their own will, who were encouraged, who were forced to leave. That reversal of fortunes, if we want to understand how to identify not only, or perhaps mostly through pain and sorrow, as you've heard from the two witnesses that offered their just a few minutes ago, if we're able to understand our experience as sojourners and continue to see ourselves as such, as custodians of a land that we need to share with others, perhaps we can better understand the necessity of sharing and not seeing the land as ours to do with as we would choose. Interestingly, when we read the Torah reading this morning, and I only thought about it as I was reading it, the section chosen talks about what the children of Israel will be faced with when they enter the land after the 40 years sojourning in the desert as homeless for that period of time. And it talks about what we need, what we will encounter in the land. We'll encounter nations that we need to displace. We need to remove them. Their culture, their religion, their idolatry is a threat to our existence, and they need to be destroyed. And as I was reading that this morning, after having looked at these various articles, I found it rather painful. Is that the message? Is that our message when we're celebrating Yom Ha'atzmaut? To recollect, as evil and as horrible as the culture may have been of those peoples, is that the message we want to convey to ourselves, as to our children and fellow celebrants? We recall a time when we were able and strove to displace and remove and destroy peoples who lived there so we could replace them and create our own home there. Is that something we've done in the last 73 years as well? Perhaps there's a different way of viewing it. And I think this idea of custodianship of the land, understanding that it's there to enjoy, but to share with others, just as the indigenous peoples in Canada and elsewhere see themselves as custodians of the land in the past. They only use the terminology owning that land and having that land because that's the only terminology and semantics that our culture understands. And that's why they're striving in recent decades to regain control and use of their land and their resources. They have to use the same terminology. But perhaps it would be better for all of us, whether in Canada or in Israel, to view ourselves as guardians, custodians of a land, but a land that needs to be shared and that should have opportunity for others who live there or who have lived there in the past to be able to enjoy its benefits at the same time. And my charge to you on this Yom HaAtzmaut is to celebrate. It's a miracle that exists and that we have a place as a Jewish people that we can consider, can be proud, but at the same time, we have to be aware and willing and to acknowledge that there are things that we have perhaps gone in a different direction, things that we have done that perhaps are not in line with the values upon which we hope to establish a state, messianic or otherwise. And hopefully that type of critical self-examination and introspection is something that will lead us as Jews in the diaspora, as well as all Israelis living in Israel, to build something that is progressive and inclusive and answers the needs of all its citizens. So with that, I wish you all a Yom HaAtzmaut, an enjoyable one, a meaningful one, and a courageous one. All right, go ahead.
Michael, I agree with everything that you said at the end, and it's very heartbreaking for us to deal with. But I wanted to go back to what you said before when you were asking why the relationship between Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, one right after the other. And it's a very valid question, and we wonder why we do that. But if you think back to the kids who are on USY and go on pilgrimage, I was always fascinated that they took them to the, and the March of the Living, they took them to the camps, they took them into the Holocaust sites so that they could learn about it. And then they get on a plane and they go to Israel, and you go from the deepest despair to hope. And somehow we have to try and keep that hope alive and see if we can't work with both sides to come to some kind of a solution. But I think it's important to end on a positive.
Absolutely. Although, and I don't hesitate to say this, I always had great challenge with the agenda of showing our youth the tragedy, for the most part, although that has changed, of our experience in Poland, certainly 2 generations ago, and leaving there feeling that Europe, and certainly Poland, is not much more than a cemetery, a graveyard for Jews at best, without the sense, and I say this because I worked with youth exchange with Polish youth and Israeli youth, as well as leading a number of birthright missions and March of the Living missions. So I had that experience where, those who participated left there saying there's nothing less for us for Europe. Our experience there is bad. The only solution is Israel. And then when you come to Israel, you are overwhelmed with the beauty of the land, the light, the color, after experiencing what seemed to me like a very black and white and gray experience in Poland. And in a sense, I found that often put a bit of blinders on us. Israel is the answer for the Jews. This is for us. If there's anybody else here, we'll kind of, find a way of managing with them. But this is for us. This is Jews, the state of the Jews. All our symbols are Jewishly oriented. Our national anthem, the menorah, that is one of the national symbols. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I'm saying that often when we pack in all that emotionally powerful and impactful experiences, it doesn't always leave our youth as open to exploring things in a more expansive way that's necessary to understand what Israel needs to be in addition to what it became.
And I'm beginning to think that joint Memorial Day celebration becomes more and more important as the years go on.
I think it doesn't, and to be honest, it's painful. It's difficult to hear both Israelis and Palestinians using the term of occupation and apartheid. But look, I lived there long enough to know that those are realities. No matter what you think of the identity of the Palestinians and the crimes they've committed against the state, and are using words that are used in common jargon, if you look at the reality there, it's not far from apartheid. I'm not being a leftist. I'm not being a bleeding heart liberal. I'm explaining what I have experienced personally through my living in Israel for 17 years and serving in the army and seeing things firsthand. There's something wrong with what's going on there. It's not a matter of who's to blame. It's a matter of how we are able to come together based on what we do share, initially perhaps pain and sorrow, as evidenced by those witnesses we heard earlier, but moving on, moving beyond that, finding a way to get beyond that, prevent that from continuing to happen, and finding a way to work together. And yes, you can say that often the other side is not willing to do that, but there are people who are willing to do that. There were more than 200,000 people who were on that service yesterday around the world. 200,000. I find that an incredibly inspiring thing. I don't know how many Palestinians, I don't know how many Israelis, I don't know how many Jews, I don't know how many non-Jews, doesn't matter. A number like 200,000 says that people have some kind of hope that there is reason and good effect in some kind of dialogue and sharing of narratives. And I hope that continues to grow in the coming years.
Yes.
Yes, thank you so much for that.
So I've kept you well beyond our usual time. I appreciate your patience and indulgence. And as I said, I hope that listening to these comments and hearing various experiences of those on the other side of the ocean is something that just gives you reason and pause to think about things in a different way. We're not trying to change your mind about things, but we're trying to see things from a broader perspective. It's very comfortable to enjoy Israel in the regular celebratory tone and environment that we would like on Yom Ha'atzmaut. But we need to move beyond that. We're not in a world that can rest and exist only on nostalgia, and I don't hesitate to use certain mythologies. So I appreciate your openness and sticking with it for the last hour, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you,
Same here.
Michael, for a
Take care.
very insightful.
Thank you, Micah.
Thank you so much. Take care, everybody. Great to see you, and everyone take care and stay well, please.
Everyone, and have a good Shabbos too.
Oh, Shabbat Shalom for tomorrow, right? Already. Take care, everybody.